They thought it would be easy. Another quiet street. Another routine stop. Another moment where power sat comfortably on one side of the badge. The kind of situation that usually ends before it ever begins, because most people freeze when authority steps too close. But this time was different. Standing there was Bruce Lee. Calm, silent, unmoving, not resisting, not provoking, just watching. And that calm made them uncomfortable. Because fear is predictable, but confidence without explanation is not. The officers laughed it off at first. A few words exchanged, a tone that carried entitlement more than justice. They assumed control simply because they always had it before. To them, this wasn't about law or safety. It was about dominance. And Bruce Lee didn't bow to it. His posture stayed relaxed. His eyes stayed focused. No sudden movements. No anger. Just awareness. That alone was enough to shift the energy. Because when someone refuses to shrink, it forces others to reveal who they really are. The tension thickened. What started as a routine interaction slowly turned into something darker. Voices rose. Space was invaded. The kind of pressure designed to break someone mentally before anything else happens. The kind of moment where most people panic, apologize, or submit just to make it stop. But Bruce Lee didn't. And that refusal, that quiet resistance, lit a fuse. They mistook his silence for weakness. They mistook his discipline for fear. They mistook his patience for surrender. And that misjudgment would cost them far more than they realized. Because what they didn't know, what no one on that street knew, was that this moment was being watched. Not by cameras, not by crowds, but by something far more dangerous to abuse of power. Every action has consequences. Every choice creates a chain reaction. And while the officers believed they were in control, they were already stepping into a situation they couldn't escape. This wasn't just another stop. This wasn't just another target. This was the moment everything started to turn, and they had no idea who was about to arrive. The calm didn't last. It never does when authority feels challenged. One officer stepped closer, invading Bruce Lee's personal space, testing how far he could push before getting a reaction. Another circled slightly behind him, not officially, not by protocol, but by instinct. The kind of instinct that comes from years of knowing no one questions you. Their voices sharpened. Not loud yet. Controlled. Calculated. The tone used when intimidation is meant to feel professional. Bruce Lee noticed everything. He noticed a shift in body language. The tightening grip on the radio. The glance exchange between uniforms. Silent permission. This wasn't about resolving anything anymore. This was about asserting dominance and reminding him who held the power. And that was the moment the situation crossed an invisible line. They began stacking commands. Fast, confusing, contradictory, a classic pressure tactic. Speak fast enough, and any hesitation becomes an excuse. Any pause becomes noncompliance. Any calm response becomes suspicious behavior. Still, Bruce Lee didn't react the way they expected. He spoke slowly, clearly, respectfully. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue, and that only made them angrier. Because intimidation loses its effect when the target refuses to emotionally collapse. The officer closest to him scoffed. A smile flashed, not friendly, not amused. The kind of smile that signals a decision has already been made. The situation no longer needed facts. It only needed justification. Around them, the street felt quieter. Too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. Bruce Lee sensed it, the tipping point. The moment where reason exits and ego takes control. He adjusted his stance, not aggressively, but defensively. Balanced, grounded, ready for anything, even though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. But hope doesn't stop abuse of power. One officer accused him of something vague. Another repeated it louder. Repetition turns assumptions into truth. And truth, when spoken by authority, becomes weaponized. Hands move closer, not touching yet, but close enough to threaten. This was no longer about the law. This was about humiliation, about forcing submission, about showing that calm confidence would be punished. And in that moment, Bruce Lee understood something clearly. This was designed to break him mentally before anything else happened. If he reacted emotionally, they'd win. If he stayed calm, they'd escalate until they could justify whatever came next. It was a trap, and they were building it piece by piece. What they didn't know was that their every move was being documented in ways they couldn't see. Not through phones or body cams, but through systems far beyond this street, far beyond this city. Because Bruce Lee wasn't just standing there as a son. He was standing there as someone protected by something bigger than all of them. And while the officers felt untouchable in that moment, the truth was already closing in around them. Slowly, quietly, relentlessly, the power they were abusing was about to turn on them. They just didn't feel it yet. The shift was subtle at first. A step too close. A command repeated 1 second faster than necessary. A hand hovering where it didn't need to be. Small things. The kind of details most people miss. But Bruce Lee didn't. He could feel the situation tightening like a knot being pulled 1 inch at a time. This wasn't chaos yet. It was calculated pressure. The officers were no longer reacting. They were deciding. One of them spoke again, louder now, framing his words carefully. Not asking, declaring. The kind of statement designed to provoke a response, because any response could be twisted into justification. Bruce Lee took a breath. Slow, controlled, measured. He reminded himself, panic feeds authority. Emotion gives them power. He stayed grounded, eyes forward, voice steady. He didn't match their volume. He didn't mirror their aggression. And that was the problem. Because nothing frustrates unchecked power more than discipline it can't dominate. The officer behind him shifted position again, closer than before. Too close. Not accidental. Bruce Lee adjusted his stance instinctively, not aggressively, just enough to keep balance. That single movement changed everything. Don't move. The command snapped through the air like a switch being flipped. Another voice joined in. Louder. Sharper. Suddenly there were multiple instructions, overlapping, conflicting. Hands raised. Hands down. Turn slightly. Stay still. Each second became a test designed to be failed. Bruce Lee realized the truth in that moment. This was no longer about compliance. This was about control collapsing. One officer stepped in front of him, face tight, jaw clenched. The calm professionalism was gone now. In its place, irritation, ego, the need to reassert dominance before it slipped completely. Why are you acting nervous? The officer demanded. Bruce Lee didn't answer immediately. Not because he was scared, but because he was choosing his words carefully. Silence, in moments like this, is dangerous. But the wrong words are worse. I'm not nervous, he said calmly. I'm cooperating. That sentence should have ended it. Instead, it triggered the mistake. The officer scoffed, turned slightly toward his partner. A look passed between them, the kind that doesn't need words. A decision made silently, fueled by pride more than procedure. That's when the tone changed. No longer controlled, no longer measured. Now it was sharp, dismissive, edged with threat. Accusations became broader. Facts became irrelevant. Everything Bruce Lee did was now interpreted as intent. And then it happened. One officer reached out, not violently, not dramatically, but unnecessarily. A grip placed where it didn't belong. Not to restrain, not to protect, but to assert. That touch crossed the final line. The street seemed to pause. Bruce Lee's body reacted before his mind could catch up. A slight shift, a reflex rooted in years of discipline. Not an attack, not resistance, just instinct. But instinct was all they needed. See, one officer said immediately. That's what I was talking about. Justification had been created. What followed wasn't chaos. It was momentum. A situation spiraling not because it had to, but because no one with power was willing to step back. Bruce Lee felt the pressure close in from all sides. Voices overlapping. Space collapsing. His awareness sharpened. He focused on staying upright, staying calm, staying human in a moment designed to strip all three away. And somewhere in the middle of that storm, something shifted. A radio crackled. A call came through. Quiet first, almost missed. One officer glanced down, distracted for half a second. That half second mattered, because while they were focused on asserting control, something else was already moving toward them. Something they couldn't intimidate. something that didn't respond to badges or tone. They didn't know it yet, but the moment they crossed that line, the situation stopped being theirs. The mistake wasn't touching him. The mistake wasn't escalating. The mistake was believing no one more powerful was watching. And in the distance, just out of sight, a vehicle turned onto the street. Everything was about to change. For a moment, everything slowed, not because the situation calmed down, but because it reached a strange, dangerous stillness, the kind that comes right before control collapses. Bruce Lee stood centered in the chaos. Voices hovered around him. Authority pressed in from every side. The officer spoke in sharp fragments now, not fully thinking, reacting more to emotion than reason. Their confidence had shifted into something else. Not certainty, but insecurity. They had escalated too far to back down gracefully. And backing down now would feel like losing. So instead of stepping away, they leaned further in. But the energy in the air had changed. Bruce Lee felt it. The officers felt it. Even the street itself seemed aware that something irreversible had already happened. Then, a distant sound. Not loud, not dramatic, just noticeable enough to matter. The low hum of an engine slowing. No one reacted immediately. Why would they? Cars passed by all the time. People came and went. This was just another moment they believed they controlled. But Bruce Lee glanced slightly to the side. He saw a dark vehicle come to a smooth, deliberate stop at the edge of the street. Not rushed, not nervous, purposeful. One officer noticed too, just for a split second. A flicker of distraction crossed his face. But he shook it off, trying to keep control of the narrative. Focus, he muttered under his breath. Bruce Lee remained silent now, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood something important. The more he spoke, the more they twisted his words. The less he reacted, the more exposed their behavior became. The officers didn't realize it yet, but the power dynamic was already starting to tilt. The driver's door of the vehicle opened. Slowly, no shouting, no dramatic entrance, just controlled movement. A woman stepped out. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She didn't raise her voice. She walked with a calm that felt heavier than anger. Her posture alone shifted the mood. One officer finally turned fully toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "Ma'am, stay back," he said, automatically slipping into command mode. But she didn't stop walking, not because she didn't hear him, but because she didn't recognize his authority over this moment. Bruce Lee recognized her instantly, and in that recognition, a quiet sense of certainty settled in. The officers, however, were confused. She didn't look like someone who was afraid. She didn't look like someone who needed permission. She didn't look like someone who could be dismissed. She stopped a few steps away, looked at Bruce Lee first, not with panic, not with fear, but with controlled concern and confidence. Then she looked at the officers, and everything about the scene shifted. The tone of her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "What seems to be the problem?" The question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. One officer scoffed slightly. "This is an active situation," he replied. "Please step aside." She tilted her head slightly, studying them, not reacting emotionally, but analyzing. "I will not step aside," she said quietly. That sentence landed heavier than shouting ever could. The officers exchanged quick looks. Who was she? Why wasn't she intimidated? Why didn't she sound like someone who could be brushed off? Bruce Lee could feel the tension pulling in a new direction. The situation was no longer centered on him. Now the spotlight was on the officers, on their decisions, on their behavior, on their escalation. The woman reached into her coat pocket. Not dramatically, not suddenly, deliberately. For a moment, the officers tensed, unsure what to expect. She held up an identification card, not close enough for the viewer to see clearly, but close enough for the officers to read. Their reactions changed instantly. A subtle shift at first, a pause, a flicker of uncertainty. The badge wasn't local. The authority didn't come from their department, and the weight behind it was far heavier than theirs. The woman's voice remained steady. "My name is Name Withheld," she said. "I am with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The officers froze, not physically but mentally, because suddenly this wasn't just another encounter they could explain away. This was now federal, documented, accountable. And for the first time since this began, the power they had been leaning on started to feel fragile. They realized it too late. The moment they thought they controlled was the moment it slipped from their hands. Silence settled over the street like a weight. Not the calm kind, the dangerous kind. The kind that comes when people realize the story has changed, but no one knows how to rewrite it. The officers stood straighter now. Not confident, careful. Their voices, once sharp and commanding, softened just enough to sound professional again. Too professional. The kind of tone people use when they suddenly remember they might be judged later. One officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, choosing his words carefully, "this is a local matter. We're handling it according to procedure." The woman didn't respond immediately. She looked at Bruce Lee again, not checking on him, but grounding the moment. Then she turned back to the officers. "Then procedure won't be a problem," she replied calmly. That sentence hit harder than accusation ever could, because procedure is only comfortable when you've followed it. The officer nearest her nodded stiffly. "Of course. That's what we're doing." But his body language told a different story. His shoulders were tense. His hands moved unnecessarily. He adjusted his belt, his radio, anything to release the pressure building under his uniform. Another officer jumped in quickly, sensing the imbalance. "He was acting suspicious," he said, gesturing toward Bruce Lee. "We had reason to escalate." The woman tilted her head slightly. "Suspicious how?" The question was simple. Too simple. He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Long enough to be noticed. "Well, his behavior," the officer said. "His posture. His movements." "So," she replied evenly, "nothing specific." The officer opened his mouth, then closed it again. Bruce Lee stayed silent. He understood the moment perfectly. This was no longer about what he did. It was about what they could prove. And vague words crumble under scrutiny. Another officer stepped forward, trying a different approach. "Look, this situation doesn't need to escalate further. We can all move on." The woman met his gaze. "You've already escalated it," she said. "I'm here to document how." The word document changed everything. It was no longer about control in the moment. It was about the record, the timeline, the report that would exist long after this street returned to normal. The officers exchanged quick glances. They were recalculating. One of them tried to laugh lightly, as if easing tension. "Ma'am, you don't understand what we deal with out here." She nodded once. "I understand patterns," she said. "And this one concerns me." That was the crack. The officer who had first reached for Bruce Lee shifted uncomfortably. His confidence drained into defensiveness. "Are you accusing us of something?" She didn't raise her voice. "I'm observing," she said. "Your reactions will decide the rest." The implication was clear. Say the wrong thing, and it becomes part of the case. Suddenly, every word mattered. The officers slowed down. Their sentences became rehearsed. They spoke less, choosing silence over risk. Authority was no longer loud, it was cautious. Bruce Lee felt the change fully now. The pressure on his chest eased. The space around him opened slightly. No one touched him. No one commanded him. For the first time since this began, he was treated like a person instead of a problem. One officer finally spoke again. "So, what happens now?" The woman looked at him steadily. "Now," she said, "you explain the encounter from the beginning." His eyes widened slightly. "Here." "Yes," she replied. "While details are fresh." The officers stiffened. This wasn't standard. This wasn't comfortable. This wasn't something they could delay. The officer began speaking, slowly, carefully, framing every sentence to sound reasonable. But the more he talked, the clearer the inconsistencies became. He contradicted himself. He skipped steps. He emphasized intent instead of actions. The woman listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. Why did physical contact occur? The street went quiet again. He swallowed. For officer's safety. She nodded. What specific threat justified it? He hesitated longer this time. That hesitation said everything. Bruce Lee watched as authority unraveled not through confrontation, but through accountability. No yelling, no arguing, just questions that demanded truth instead of power. The woman closed her notebook. This interaction isn't over, she said, but it is no longer yours to control. The officers stood frozen, not by force, but by realization. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. And now, every step they took forward would be watched closely. The shift didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. A look held a second too long. A question that wasn't answered. A silence that suddenly felt dangerous. The officers had stopped posturing. Now, they were thinking, and thinking too late. One of them glanced again at the identification the woman had shown earlier, replaying the moment in his mind. He hadn't just seen a badge. He'd seen jurisdiction, oversight, consequences. And slowly, the weight of it settled in. This wasn't a local observer. This wasn't a complaint waiting to happen. This was federal presence, in real time. The officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, more respectfully now, "are you involved in the situation personally?" The question was careful, defensive, almost hopeful. The woman met his eyes. "Yes," she replied. "I am." That single word tightened the air. Bruce Lee felt it immediately. The way attention snapped back to him, not as a suspect, but as a connection, as a variable they hadn't accounted for. "In what capacity?" another officer asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward Bruce Lee. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, not to protect him, not to shield him, but to make something unmistakably clear. "This is my son," she said. The word landed like impact. Son, not client, not witness, not bystander. Son. The officers froze, not physically, but internally, because suddenly, this encounter wasn't just professional misconduct under observation. It was personal to the person observing it. One officer exhaled slowly, trying to stay composed. "Ma'am, we had no idea." She raised a hand gently. "I know," she said. "That's part of the problem." No anger, no shouting, just disappointment, measured and devastating. Another officer spoke, voice tight. "We treat everyone the same." She nodded. "That's what concerns me." The realization spread across their faces in real time. This wasn't about defending a report anymore. This wasn't about justifying a decision. This was about explaining behavior to someone trained to dissect patterns, intent, and abuse of authority for a living. The officer who had escalated things earlier shifted his weight. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we didn't do anything outside our training." The woman looked directly at him. "Then your training will be reviewed," she said calmly. That sentence did what yelling never could. It stripped the room of illusion. Because training is institutional, and institutional failures don't stay small. Bruce Lee watched their confidence drain. The men who had once stood tall now avoided eye contact. Radios were quiet. No one interrupted. No one rushed. They were suddenly aware of every camera, every witness, every second that could be replayed. One officer swallowed hard. Is this being reported?" The woman's gaze didn't waver. "It already is." That was the moment fear fully arrived. Not panic, not chaos. Fear of process, of investigation, of review boards, of supervisors asking questions they couldn't answer. Bruce Lee felt something else too, relief. Not because someone powerful had arrived, but because truth finally had room to breathe. The woman turned to him again. "Are you all right?" He nodded. "Yes." Simple. Honest. Enough. She turned back to the officers. "You will provide your names, badge numbers, and a clear account of why this encounter escalated." No one argued. They complied. Not because they wanted to, but because resistance was no longer an option. One officer tried once more to regain footing. "We can resolve this internally." She looked at him with quiet certainty. "You already tried." The street felt different now. Not tense, exposed. The power that once felt absolute had shrunk under scrutiny. And the officers understood something they hadn't before. This wasn't about punishment. This was about accountability. And accountability doesn't care how uncomfortable the truth feels. Bruce Lee stood taller now, not in defiance, but in dignity. The encounter that was meant to break him had instead revealed something else entirely. The woman took one final look at the officers. "This interaction will be reviewed," she said. "What happens next depends on honesty." Then she turned to her son. "Let's go." And as they walked away, The officers remained where they stood, watching control disappear down the street, knowing the real consequences were only just beginning. They didn't follow. They didn't call out. They didn't try to regain control. The officers stood exactly where they were as Bruce Lee and his mother walked away, not because they were told to, but because they no longer knew what to do next. The street slowly returned to normal. A car passed by. A door closed somewhere in the distance. Life continued, indifferent to the moment that had just unfolded. But for the people left behind, nothing felt the same. The silence now wasn't threatening. It was heavy with realization. Bruce Lee and his mother walked side by side, their steps steady, unhurried. She didn't lecture him. She didn't ask questions. She simply walked with him, present, calm, grounded. That presence mattered. It reminded him of something important. Dignity doesn't come from winning a confrontation. It comes from surviving it without losing yourself. Behind them, the officers finally moved. One of them exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. Another stared at the pavement, replaying every word, every step, every decision. They weren't angry anymore. They were aware. Aware that power is temporary. Aware that authority without accountability collapses under scrutiny. Aware that one moment of ego can echo for years. None of this had gone the way they expected. They had assumed control was automatic. That uniform spoke louder than behavior. That no one would question them. They were wrong. Because real authority isn't about who raises their voice the loudest. It's about who can stand still when the truth arrives. For Bruce Lee, the moment stayed with him. Not as trauma, but as clarity. He understood now how easily situations can turn, how quickly perception replaces fact, and how important it is to remain centered when everything around you tries to destabilize you. He hadn't needed to fight. He hadn't needed to prove anything. He had needed to endure. And endurance, when paired with accountability, becomes something powerful. His mother finally spoke as they reached the vehicle. "You handled that well," she said. "Not praise. Recognition." He nodded. "You taught me how." She smiled faintly, not out of pride, but understanding. They got into the car and drove away, leaving behind a moment that would be written into reports, reviewed in meetings, and discussed behind closed doors. But the real impact wasn't on paper. It was internal. For the officers, it was the realization that every encounter carries weight, and that misuse of power doesn't disappear just because no one screams. For Bruce Lee, it was confirmation that calm is not weakness, and dignity is not submission. And for the viewer watching this story unfold, the message was clear. Power without accountability is dangerous. Silence does not mean consent, and justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives calmly, holding a badge you didn't expect. This wasn't a story about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about exposure, about how quickly control fades when truth enters the room. The street looked ordinary again, but something had changed, because somewhere in that quiet moment, a line had been drawn, not with force, but with awareness. And once awareness exists, it can't be undone. And